Hello everyone, welcome to tonight's chilling tale. Buckle up, because we're about to dive into a story that will send shivers down your spine. Picture an old, abandoned hospital on the outskirts of a nameless town. Rumor has it that anyone who dares to take a job there in the morgue doesn't live to tell the tale. Our story begins with a man named Jack, who, out of sheer desperation, steps into this haunting mystery. Jack was a man down on his luck. He spent most of his days lounging around, drinking and gambling. His wife had finally had enough and filed for divorce. With no job, no prospects, and no skills to boast about, Jack was running out of options. After yet another failed job interview, he trudged home, feeling more defeated than ever. That's when he saw it. A faded, tattered flyer pinned to a wall. It was a job ad for a night watchman at a hospital's morgue. Despite the warning bells ringing in his head, Jack decided to check it out. Desperation has a way of making people do things they normally wouldn't. He found the hospital easily enough. It stood out like a sore thumb, surrounded by overgrown weeds and broken windows. It didn't look like a place anyone would want to work, let alone spend the night. But Jack needed a job, and this was his last hope. He walked through the crumbling entrance, feeling the weight of the eerie silence pressing down on him. The hospital's walls were peeling, and the air was thick with a musty smell. Jack's footsteps echoed as he wandered through the empty halls. He saw no one, heard no one. Just as he was about to call out, he felt a tap on his shoulder. Startled, he turned around to see a woman in a white coat. She introduced herself as Dr. Anna and seemed surprised to see him. Jack explained he was there for the job, and Dr. Anna nodded, remembering the ad. She led him to a small office where an older man named Mr. Collins sat behind a desk, smoking a cigarette. After a brief exchange, Mr. Collins gave Jack a rundown of his duties and a few strict rules. No one was allowed into the morgue after midnight, and no matter what he heard, he was to ignore any noises coming from inside. Jack's anxiety spiked, but he nodded in agreement. With that, Mr. Collins handed him the keys, muttering something about good luck and not forgetting the rules. As night fell, the hospital grew even more foreboding. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but he tried to push it aside. He had a job now, and he needed to keep it. As he patrolled the silent corridors, the air seemed to grow colder and the shadows deeper. The hospital was completely deserted. He hadn't seen a single patient or staff member since he arrived. Trying to calm his nerves, he took a swig from a flask he kept hidden in his coat. The alcohol warmed him and he settled into a chair, eventually dozing off. Jack awoke with a start, glancing at his watch. It was midnight. Remembering Mr. Collins' warning, he decided to do one last check of the morgue before trying to get some more sleep. As he approached the heavy metal door, he heard it, a faint knocking from the other side. His heart pounded in his chest. He knew the morgue was supposed to be empty. He froze, Mr. Collins' words echoing in his mind. No matter what you hear, ignore it. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. Sweat trickled down Jack's forehead. He backed away, turning to retreat to the safety of the office. But as he did, the knocking stopped, and a loud banging came from the office door. Jack's first instinct was to open the door, but he hesitated, recalling the second rule. He called out, asking who it was, and a woman's voice replied, pleading for help. She claimed her son wasn't dead and begged Jack to let her into the morgue. Jack, torn between his instructions and the woman's desperate cries, decided to stand his ground. He told her to come back in the morning, hoping she would leave, but the banging intensified. The woman's pleas turned to screams. Jack could hear her sobbing, claiming she was on her knees. He couldn't bear it any longer. He opened the door, and there she was, tears streaming down her face. The air around her was icy cold, sending chills through Jack's body. She begged him one last time, and against his better judgment, he agreed to take her to the morgue. As they approached the door, a cold draft seeped out, making Jack shiver. He unlocked it, and a blast of frigid air hit him. The woman stepped inside, but as soon as she did, she vanished. Jack stood there, stunned. He considered running, but felt compelled to see this through. He stepped into the morgue, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. To his horror, he saw a body on one of the slabs that hadn't been there before. His hands trembling, he lifted the sheet. The face that stared back at him was the same woman who had just begged him for help. Jack staggered back, dropping his flashlight. In the dim light, he saw the morgue door close on its own. Panic surged through him, but he knew he had to get out. He turned to run, but the door had vanished. The room felt like it was closing in on him. From the shadows, the woman's voice echoed, asking if he had found her son. Jack, consumed by terror, started running down the dark corridors, hoping to find an exit. He ran and ran until he was completely exhausted. When he finally saw the hospital's entrance, his relief was short-lived. Standing there were two figures, the woman and a small boy, both staring at him with vacant eyes. Just as Jack turned to flee, he saw Mr. Collins and Dr. Anna, their faces twisted in ghastly expressions. They looked nothing like the living people he had met earlier. Jack's heart couldn't take it. He collapsed, the last thing he saw being their haunting, spectral forms. The next day, the news reported a man found dead in the morgue of the old hospital, apparently from fright. Locals spoke of a tragedy that occurred over a decade ago, a boy who died in a car accident, his mother losing her sanity and burning down the hospital when she was denied access to the morgue. Mr. Collins and Dr. Anna had perished in the fire, their spirits said to haunt the place ever since. And now, Jack had become the latest victim of the hospital's cursed history. The news of Jack's death spread quickly, becoming another grim legend associated with the old hospital. It wasn't long before another desperate soul found their way to the ominous flyer. This time, it was a woman named Emily. She was struggling to make ends meet and saw the ad as her last hope. Emily wasn't easily scared. She had faced many challenges in her life and wasn't about to let an old, decrepit building get the best of her. She arrived at the hospital, noticing the same eerie signs Jack had seen. The overgrown weeds, broken windows, and an overwhelming sense of abandonment. But she pressed on, determined to get the job. As she stepped inside, the air seemed to thicken with an oppressive silence. The hospital looked even more rundown than she had imagined. She wandered the empty halls, her footsteps echoing eerily. She found her way to the small office where Mr. Collins should have been. Instead, she was greeted by a different figure, a tall, thin man with hollow eyes, who introduced himself as Mr. Anderson. Mr. Anderson explained the job in a cold, detached manner, his eyes never quite meeting hers. He handed her a set of keys and reiterated the rules. No one in the morgue after midnight, and ignore any noises. Emily nodded, feeling a shiver run down her spine, but she pushed her unease aside. She needed this job. That night, Emily patrolled the hospital's darkened corridors. The place felt like a tomb, each shadow a whisper of its tragic past. She could almost hear the echoes of those who had perished within these walls. Trying to shake off her growing apprehension, she focused on her duties. Midnight approached, and with it the sense of dread grew stronger. Emily made her way to the morgue, her flashlight casting long, flickering shadows. She reached the door, pausing as a cold draft seeped out. Just as she was about to turn away, she heard it, a soft, persistent knocking. Emily's heart pounded. She remembered Mr. Anderson's warning, but curiosity got the better of her. She leaned closer, listening intently. The knocking grew louder, more urgent. Emily backed away, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She turned to leave, but the knocking was now coming from behind her, from the office. Torn between fear and a sense of duty, Emily made her way to the office. The door was shut, but she could hear a woman's voice on the other side, pleading for help. The voice was eerily familiar, yet Emily couldn't place it. She hesitated, then called out, asking who it was. The woman claimed her son was in the morgue and needed help. She begged Emily to let her in. Emily's mind raced. She wanted to follow the rules, but the woman's desperation was palpable. Against her better judgment, Emily opened the door. She was met with a blast of icy air, and there stood the woman, her face pale and drawn, tears streaming down her cheeks. Emily's blood ran cold. as she recognized the woman from a photo she had seen earlier in the hospital. A photo of a mother who had died in the fire. The woman's presence filled Emily with an overwhelming sense of dread, but she couldn't turn her away. She agreed to take her to the morgue. They walked through the darkened halls, the woman's sobs echoing around them. Emily felt like she was walking in a nightmare, each step heavier than the last. As they reached the morgue, Emily unlocked the door with trembling hands. A blast of frigid air hit them, and the woman stepped inside. Emily followed, but as soon as she crossed the threshold, the woman vanished. The room felt colder than before, the shadows longer and darker. Emily's flashlight flickered, then died, plunging her into darkness. Panic surged through her, but she forced herself to stay calm. She fumbled for her phone, using its light to navigate. She saw a body lying on one of the slabs that hadn't been there before. With shaking hands, she lifted the sheet. The face beneath was the woman's, her eyes wide open, staring blankly. Emily stumbled back, her mind reeling. The door to the morgue slammed shut, trapping her inside. She pounded on it and screaming for help, but no one came. The temperature dropped further, and Emily felt a presence behind her. She turned, and there was the woman's ghost, her expression twisted in agony. "Have you found my son?" the ghost whispered, her voice like a cold wind. Emily backed away, her heart racing. She tried to find another exit, but the room seemed to shift and change around her. She was disoriented, lost in a labyrinth of darkness and cold. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Mr. Anderson, his eyes hollow and lifeless. He was joined by Mr. Collins and Dr. Anna, their faces contorted in ghastly grins. Emily realized she was surrounded by the spirits of those who had died in the hospital. They closed in on her, their eyes filled with malice. Emily's screams echoed through the empty halls, but no one heard her. By the time the sun rose, she was just another lifeless body in the morgue, her face frozen in a mask of terror. The news reported another death at the old hospital, but the locals were no longer surprised. They spoke of the hospital's cursed history, of the boy who had died and his mother's tragic end. The stories of the haunting spread, but the flyer continued to appear, luring the desperate and the unwary. Months passed after Emily's death, and the stories about the hospital grew darker. People whispered about the strange occurrences and the missing individuals, but as always, desperation led another soul to that dreadful place. This time, it was a man named Robert. He was a skeptic, a man of science who scoffed at the supernatural. To him, the tales of hauntings were just that, tales. He was confident that he could handle whatever the hospital threw at him. Robert found the flyer while looking for work. Intrigued by the challenge, he decided to investigate. Armed with his rational mind and a few gadgets to debunk any so-called paranormal activity, he headed to the hospital. Like those before him, he noticed the dilapidated state of the building. However, instead of feeling fear, he felt a rush of excitement at the prospect of proving the legends wrong. He entered the hospital, flashlight in hand, and began his exploration. The eerie silence and the cold, damp air did little to deter him. He made his way to the office, where he expected to find someone in charge. To his surprise, he was greeted by a woman named Mrs. Thompson, a stern-looking nurse with piercing eyes. Mrs. Thompson explained the job, much like Mr. Anderson had done for Emily. She handed Robert the keys and repeated the rules. No entry into the morgue after midnight, and ignore any noises. Robert, with a confident smile, assured her that he understood. As she turned to leave, she gave him one last, almost pitying look, which unsettled him more than he cared to admit. That night, Robert set up his equipment around the hospital. He had cameras, motion sensors, and audio recorders, all tools to capture and debunk any paranormal activity. Midnight approached, and Robert made his way to the morgue. The atmosphere grew heavier and the temperature dropped noticeably, but Robert remained unfazed. As he stood outside the morgue, the knocking began. Robert's logical mind dismissed it as a prank, or perhaps an animal trapped inside. He decided to confront the source of the noise directly. With his flashlight steady, He opened the door and stepped into the cold, dark room. The knocking ceased, and an oppressive silence filled the space. Robert moved his flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness. His gadgets beeped and whirred, but he saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just as he was about to leave, he heard a faint whisper, a child's voice, pleading for help. Robert froze, his skepticism wavering. The voice grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from one of the covered bodies. Against his better judgment, Robert approached the body. His hands shook slightly as he lifted the sheet, revealing the small, lifeless form of a boy. The boy's eyes suddenly opened, and he let out a blood-curdling scream. Robert stumbled back, his flashlight dropping and rolling away, plunging the room into darkness. Panicking, Robert fumbled for his phone, but it was dead. He was left in the pitch-black room, the boy's scream still ringing in his ears. He felt a cold hand on his shoulder and spun around, only to find himself face to face with the boy's mother. Her ghostly figure loomed over him, her eyes filled with sorrow and rage. "Why didn't you save him?" she whispered, her voice echoing in the room. Robert tried to back away, but the temperature dropped even further, and he felt as though he was being suffocated by the cold. The ghostly figures of the hospital's previous victims began to appear, surrounding him, their faces twisted in torment. Robert's rational mind shattered as he was confronted by the undeniable reality of the supernatural. He screamed for help, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive darkness. The ghosts closed in on him, their cold, clammy hands reaching out, pulling him into their world. The next morning, the news reported another tragic death at the hospital. Robert's body was found in the morgue, his face contorted in terror. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the latest victim of the cursed hospital. The flyer, however, continued to appear, as if mocking those who dared to believe they could escape the fate that awaited them within those haunted walls. As the years passed, the hospital's reputation only grew darker. More and more people fell prey to its malevolent spirits, each one adding to the growing legend. The hospital stood as a grim reminder of the past, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead was perilously thin. And so, dear listeners, we come to the end of our tale. The haunted hospital remains a symbol of fear and tragedy, a place where the echoes of the past continue to haunt the present. Remember, some stories are not just stories. They are warnings. Heed them well, and stay far away from places where the shadows linger and the dead refuse to rest. Thank you for joining me on this chilling journey. Until next time, stay safe. Beware the things that go bump in the night. I hope you enjoyed this spine-tingling saga. If you have any more stories you'd like to explore, or if you need assistance with anything else, feel free to reach out. Sweet dreams, and remember, some doors are better left closed.